Hi, Adetola, are you there?
Yes, I'm there. Sorry, my phone was hanging for a bit. I'm fine. Good afternoon. Thank you. What about you?
Fine, thank you. How are you? How's your exams?
Well, doing fine. We thank God. Fine. Thank you.
Okay. So are you done now? Like with everything for
Yes,
the semester?
yes, I'm done. I'm break.
Okay. That, that, okay. So are you in 300 or 500?
I'm in 300 level.
Okay.
Did
Okay.
you,
Well done. You are doing
did you
very
get
well.
that?
I remember when I didn't know anything about IP, 500 level, I didn't know anything about IP. In law school, I did not know anything about IP until after law school. So I think it was after law school that
Oh,
how I um, got like signed to a record label, and then I decided to even try to understand IP because I didn't understand what was going on in the record label. So that was how I just started and I started reading about it and all that. So for you to know about IP like from 300 level, that's really nice because that means you have a long time to go through it and decide how you want to go about it and all that. So it's really good. And I think that you're doing very well because I see the topics that you choose to write on and they are not regular topics. They are not topics that um, people would think about easily. So, like when you wrote about space law, prior to that, I had not thought about space law. So I was thinking about it for the first time when you wrote about it. And then
oh.
cryptocurrency, I think you also wrote about that. Cryptocurrency,
Yes.
yes, cryptocurrency, AI, and all that. But what's your, as in, what kindles your interest in IP?
I do not get that. What did you say?
What sparked your interest in IP? Like how did you get to like IP?
Oh, okay. So, from the beginning, I've always liked AI and law. And then during my readings, I knew that for me to even say, okay, you know what, this is AI and law, and I'm interested in this, right? I have to understand intellectual property. So it was from then I started reading about intellectual property, and then I got to know more about it.
Okay, okay, okay. That's nice. Well, I feel that for everybody, they like get to, would I say, get to have something that sparks their interest in the field. So, like for me, it was music. So the first thing that I actually studied was music law. Then I branched out to entertainment law, like the other part of entertainment law. Then I discovered that when I go for interviews, maybe like on TV and all that, they usually ask me about patents, trademarks, and the rest. So it was those things I was like, let me not go and then fall my hand. So I remember there was an interview I went for, and that was on radio. So they asked me a question about trademarks then and all those things. So when they asked me those questions, then I wasn't sure of the answer. So it was my husband that helped me to to browse it. Sorry, the guest speaker is coming now. He
Okay.
just sent a message, so he would be here shortly.
Okay,
But
thank you.
thank you. Yes, so he's already here. Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Thank you very much for joining us. I know that your schedule is really tight. Thank you for taking the time out to be here.
Sorry, Juliana, I'm just trying to. I apologize for coming in late.
No, it's
Give me a second. Let me get this.
okay, sir. Thank you. So I've chatted the mentees to be here, and I don't know why they are late, but Detola is here, and she wrote about cultural expression and traditional knowledge. So I wanted them to write about it so that
Okay.
when they present, if it's good enough, because you better know your PhD on this, so you're like the master guru. So I didn't want you
No,
to
please
just
don't say that.
I didn't want you to just come and talk. I wanted them to like bring up their own perspective, and then if you think that there are things to be added, fine. So she's a 300 level law student, and she submitted her assignment on it. So maybe I'll just give her 5 to 7 minutes to just talk about her topic. Then you listen to it, then you can flow from there.
Okay,
Thank you.
perfect.
So Adetola, you can talk about your topic.
Okay, I'm sorry. Give me a few seconds. I want to try and access documents. I'm sorry.
Hi, Juliana. Again, apologies for coming late.
No, I know that you are very busy. I know
No,
that
please don't say
like
that.
sincerely, as in for you to even say yes, like thank you so
No,
much.
no, no.
So me as in me, I know that 1,001 people are craving your attention right now.
No,
So
no, no,
you
no.
to even
It's
have said yes in the first place,
no,
as in
it's
I'm
completely,
fulfilled. I'm fulfilled.
it's completely
Thank you.
appreciated. Honestly, I'm glad. I'm really glad to be here.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So Adetola,
Yes. So yeah, I wrote on traditional knowledge. Can you hear me?
yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So I wrote on traditional knowledge and cultural expression. First, I have to say that this topic was not I had no idea that IP can be related to, say, folklores or arts or stuff like that are country-based or national based, right? So this was like an eye-opening session or article for me. So and first I wanted to really write about, because I read somewhere that there were issues relating to Ghana, like a company owns the brand name Ghana for its chocolate brand. I wanted to write about that, but I did not get enough articles to read more on it. So I just decided to write on this particular topic. So probably if beginners like me want to read the article, they will understand, okay, yes, you can actually relate intellectual property with traditional knowledge and cultural expression. So first, I define traditional knowledge according to WIPO, World Intellectual Property Organization, as a living body of knowledge passed on from generation to generation within a community. And I also explained that traditional knowledge encompasses all know-how, skills, innovation, practices, and learning that originate in a local or traditional community, and is the outcome of intellectual work and insights. So that means that if a particular community say build something, they have the intellectual property right to that particular stuff. So, and yeah, I had to mention also that agriculture, fishing, health, and horticulture are some of the areas in which traditional knowledge is most useful. Now, I also defined cultural expressions as these expressions with cultural content that originates from the creativity of individuals, organizations, and communities. And I also mentioned some of them, which are music, arts, symbols, and performances. So then I moved on to mention the some African communities as creators of traditional cultural expressions. In South Africa, specifically Bushbrook Ridge, there are many traditional healers who provide primary health care to the people of this region. So that means the knowledge of the traditional knowledge is particular to that particular sorry, I use particular. It's particular to that community, right? So they have the intellectual property, they have a right to that knowledge of theirs. Now, also the use of rotational farming in Tanzania, that's also a traditional cultural expression, right? So then I moved on to the importance of preserving traditional knowledge and cultural expression. I wanted people to understand that there's actually this importance, like you have to protect your traditional knowledge and cultural expression, or else we'll lose them all, right? So I mentioned that it is important to put an end to the unauthorized and commercial exploitation of traditional knowledge. So, if when people so that people will not be able to exploit this traditional knowledge and your cultural expression, it's important you give them intellectual property rights. Then I also mentioned that it is important to protect the indigenous people from loss and also help them to preserve such ancient practices. Like that is a very important point. Then lastly, I mentioned that traditional knowledge must be protected in order for it to be used widely and efficiently. It's what you protect that people can use widely. When you don't protect something, I mean, people just use it anyhow, right? So methods of protecting traditional knowledge. This part was a little bit should I say complicated, because I was seeing a lot of methods, but there was one article I read and they really talked about it. So the first method is positive protection. It entails safeguarding traditional knowledge through the enactment of laws, rules, and regulations. And then I gave an example of a country in Africa right here, South Africa, which revised its intellectual property law in 2013 to provide for the recognition and protection of some traditional and indigenous phrases and expressions. So that's like an example of a country protecting its own traditional knowledge. Then the second method I mentioned was defensive mechanism, which are measures taken to prevent the acquisition of intellectual property rights over traditional knowledge. This means traditional knowledge-based innovations are protected by patents, trademarks, and geographical indications. And I believe that this is exactly where intellectual property rights comes in. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adetola. Thank you for trying to touch everywhere and for the brilliant presentation. Say, do you have anything to also say? You also submitted your presentation, so if you have something to say, just say it in about 5 minutes before he starts, please. Hello, Sewese, can you hear
Can you
me?
hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yes, I can hear you. Okay.
Okay.
All right. So this topic is very interesting because we have written almost the same thing. So I would just like to add in conclusion or in addition to what she has said, because I think from the definitions to the protection strategies which she concluded with, and then are almost similar. So I might just be repeating the same thing, but I also like to mention that there are also specific persons that have rights to traditional cultural expressions and traditional knowledge as well. So and this will include the community, which will comprise of people from with a common ancestry, similar culture, people in the same geographical space, the same ecological space, and then having the same interest as well. Then we also have the holders who also have exclusive rights. These are also recognized individuals or organizations within that same community. And then we also have the owners as well. So the owners are the local and traditional communities and also recognized individuals and organizations within such communities. So all of these people have rights to that's traditional knowledge and cultural expressions. And then, okay, she has already touched on the protection strategies, which are defensive and positive. Okay, maybe I should just add, in addition to the defensive approach and then the positive approach, another method of preserving traditional knowledge and cultural expressions would be the use of traditional knowledge digital library. So a similar example is what we have in India. They have something like that. And then another approach will also be documentation of that knowledge, traditional knowledge and cultural expressions as well. So that's it for my end. As we have just similar work.
Thank you very much, COAC. So I'll just read out Mr. Toby's profile quickly. Mr. Oluwatobiloba Moody is the counselor at JIIPCC and AG, head of the JIIPCC Nigeria office. His prior work experience includes professional legal roles with CIGIS International Law Research Program in Waterloo, Canada, JIIPCC's Traditional Knowledge Division, as well as the Appellate Body Secretariat of the World Trade Organization. He practiced briefly with the firm of Olani George and Co. in Ibadan, Nigeria, as well as the police force headquarters, Ebonyi, Nigeria Youth Service. He has a PhD in Global Intellectual Property Law from Queen's University, Canada, where his novel research in the area of traditional knowledge governance was recognized and funded by Canada's most prestigious graduate award, the Vanier Scholarship. That's an LLM in International Trade and Investment Law, cum laude from the University of Western Cape in South Africa, 2010, and an LLB from the University of Ibadan in Nigeria, 2007. He's a member of the Nigerian Bar. You're welcome, sir. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And really appreciate the opportunity to be with you today. And I want to also take immense credit to you and the great work that you've been doing, Juliana. Thanks for this platform. It's really inspiring, as I often tell you, and I'm really glad to be able to spend time with these excellent mentees today. And I also want to thank especially Tola and COSA as well for the great papers that you've written. I really hope to, or look forward to being able to see them at some point. And but I just want to thank you, because I think a lot of the issues, I almost feel like we could just run on from there. So I might just be tagging on from some of the things you've said today, and then I'll just run very quickly through a series of slides that I had prepared ahead of this meeting. So just to ask Juliana, please, I'm going to be keeping an eye on my time, but please, you're not rude to interrupt me. So just tell me when you just say, Toby, shut up, you've reached the limits. Yeah, so just, as you know, we could keep talking and talking about traditional knowledge for a long time.
Flow.
Sorry? So
it's flow.
No, so let me make sure I stay within the time that has been provided, and of course I think we'll have more time for questions and discussions as well after. So maybe just to start from the point that I wanted to pick on, and this is just to clarify something that Tola mentioned, and I think COSA also mentioned, and that's on the how to protect traditional knowledge. And you identify the positive protection and defensive protection. Now, I just want to clarify that under the positive protection, I like the way you referenced laws and rules and regulations, in terms of like enacting these kind of statutes to protect traditional knowledge. But in a way, it goes a bit beyond that, because I want you to get to thinking about positive protection as all forms of protection that empower or give rights to the holders or the owners of traditional knowledge. So where you design a protection mechanism, whether it's contracts, whether it's a law, but through it, the owners of traditional knowledge are given certain rights that they're able to enforce. It gives them almost like a sword that they have to say, look, this is my traditional knowledge, and that positive aspect is what is summed up in the ideas of positive protection. On the contrary, defensive protection, it happens when you have these protection strategies that are developed or designed to prevent third parties from acquiring the rights over traditional knowledge. So even if the holder of traditional knowledge is not aware, but there are mechanisms being put in place to prevent unauthorized acquisition of the traditional knowledge. And a good example, as Suisse had mentioned, is on the documentation. So if you think about the documentation, whether it's the documentation under the digital libraries, like the traditional knowledge digital library that you mentioned, Suisse. Now, the essence of documenting traditional knowledge in some instances is to ensure that every knowledge that's contained inside this library is knowledge that holds out that this is already existing, right? And so when the third party comes and says, oh, I'm the first person to come up with this, now the defense is that it is already contained in this document, in this documented resource, which is the digital library. Now, the strategy by many countries is then to make that digital library available to patent offices, so that when someone is going to a patent office and trying to apply for a right over some invention that's based on traditional knowledge or genetic resources, the patent examiner is able to look into that digital library and say, hey, no, it already exists in this country, and so you can't get this. And so that's a defense for the holders of the traditional knowledge. So that's a defensive strategy of protecting traditional knowledge. If it's the other way, then you come up with something like a patent. Or let me say, like, if you give the traditional knowledge holders a right, like say, everyone who holds traditional knowledge, you are given a patent, a right to have this for the next 20 years. It's similar. I'm just giving an example, like something similar to like a patent, like a right that bestows on them. Then that's more the positive type. And these things, we see them in practice intermingling. So you have some strategies that contain elements of positive and defensive. And so I just flagged that because I know, Aditola, you had referenced laws. And in some laws, you see defensive elements and you see positive elements. You can have both of them occurring within the same strategy of protection. So that's starting from, I think it's almost like starting from the back of the discussion, but I wanted to touch on that. We also will always talk about beneficiaries of protection. Who are the beneficiaries? And I think a distinction was also made between the owners and the holders, which again, I think is a very worthy thing to think about. I like the distinctions drawn between TCEs, between the TCEs, did I lose? Okay, between the TCEs and TK. So again, really glad to see the engagement across this. One other thing that I would have said is a justification that I was hoping you would mention is, protection from biopiracy. And I think I'll touch very briefly on that in the context of my presentation now. But the other ones that you have mentioned, preventing from loss, preservation for wide and efficient use, these are all valid reasons why it's important to protect traditional knowledge. So again, just to say thank you very much. I think you've already given me a very good platform on which to just fly through a presentation. So Juliana, if I can just share my screen, I'll just do that now. Okay. So I'm not going. Okay, so I'm not going to go through the entire, just for the sake of time, I won't go through the entire slides, but what I wanted to do was just to highlight some challenges around protecting traditional knowledge. I wanted to give a little introduction to touch a bit on intellectual property. What is it? Talk about traditional knowledge and the relationship between traditional knowledge and intellectual property, justification for protection. And so similar to what has already been done in your papers, and just use a case study to highlight what some of these justifications are, and then some references to the international legal framework for protecting traditional knowledge. Now, as you see, I have about 24 slides, so I'm going to just fly through, especially because I know that you have already done the background research on this. I'm not going to spend time on what is intellectual property or the common forms of IP. Key justifications, let me just mention very quickly that we'll know that key justifications for intellectual property, we have the ethical, the moral justifications, that's the natural rights the creator has in his or her work. And so IP exists to prevent third parties from reaping benefits and goodwill that's not been earned by them, and also helps to ensure that authors derive or enjoy the benefits, those natural benefits that come from their productive activity. Instrumental justifications that we have is just the role that intellectual property plays, or the effort, or the idea that intellectual property can incentivize innovation through a reward mechanism, reward system, that incentive-based system of pushing innovation and creativity in society. And so whether it's patents, it's copyrights, and I've highlighted some examples there just for your reference. Now, traditional knowledge, as has been rightly said, the content or substance of knowledge resulting from intellectual activity, usually in a traditional context. And some of the key elements is that it's handed down usually from generation to generation. It's reflective of the community's social and cultural identity. It isn't always traceable to a single author or owner. And it's constantly evolving, developing, and being recreated within communities and societies. And something that I feel it's helpful to reflect on even right now is that traditional knowledge is not, we don't have like a universally agreed definition of what traditional knowledge is. And that's very important, because to the extent that it's an area of law that is developing, to which rights have been ascribed, to which legislation is being developed or designed, there is a sense that, oh, how do we protect something that we cannot effectively describe? I mean, like that we cannot define categorically in that sense. So even in this definition that I've or this description that I've provided, it has been the source of a lot of different views on how to interpret that in practice. So when we say that traditional knowledge, for instance, is handed down from generation to generation, we've heard instances where some member states have asked that where you have countries or societies that have experienced natural disasters, for instance, where an entire generation is wiped out, does this preclude them of having traditional knowledge? So if there is a break in the chain between generations, does that mean that that society doesn't have, or what they have isn't traditional knowledge? There's also been questions around if it moves from generation to generation, does this mean that traditional knowledge, there is a certain age that's required for traditional knowledge to be traditional knowledge, which means that if you say it goes from one generation to another, then do we have to count a generation? Does that knowledge have to have been in existence for that length of time for it to be considered traditional knowledge? And so that's an example, where we also say things like, oh, it's reflective of a community's social and cultural identity. Then, there are questions of to what extent does that association have to be there? And how do you prove that? To say, oh, yes, this is traditional knowledge, this is not traditional knowledge. And all this I'm trying to say is that to the extent that efforts are being made to design an international system, particularly at JIIPCC, for the international protection of traditional knowledge, that there are these questions inherent in defining traditional knowledge. And so you could have an entire thesis on how do you define traditional knowledge. And so what we do see in practice is that a number of countries have laws that for the purposes of their law, for the purposes of interpretation, they have definitions that they have developed for in the context in which these laws are being implemented. So the Swakopmund Protocol, for instance, which is an ARIPO protocol, and which is being used widely within its member states as well. You have definitions there, and so just to say that we can have definitions, but universally there is still a lot of disagreement, or not. There isn't a universal view. I meant to say. Just as reference has been made to TCEs and TK, I will not go into it again, but just to mention that a challenging thing that has come out in a number of discussions around traditional knowledge is that, well, genetic resources, traditional knowledge, traditional cultural expressions, they often form like part of an integrated whole for the indigenous communities that hold them. And so, for instance, the knowledge that an indigenous community has about the resources within its territory, that's not only traditional knowledge associated with the genetic resources, and the expressions of their culture, which form an integral part of their livelihood, is often seen as the cultural expressions. And it's from the policy perspective, efforts are often made to distinguish this and define them differently. But indigenous peoples often reference in these negotiations and discussions that, listen, this is from an indigenous perspective, it's almost impossible to separate them, that it's all part and parcel of an integrated whole. So just to bear that in mind as well. Now, why is it difficult to reconcile, in some instances, traditional knowledge protection with the IP system? One is that there is an idea under the IP system that knowledge progenitors, people who create and who advance knowledge, are clearly identifiable. So you can tell who it is. Under traditional knowledge, the knowledge normally grows or evolves within societies, within communities, and sometimes it's a bit difficult to really point to who exactly is the where did it come from? Who is the person that invented this knowledge, I would say. Also, there is often an idea that new knowledge is clearly distinguishable from old knowledge, and you see that in patent systems, that we would reward or will protect this new invention if it's new, and you can distinguish that newness. But traditional knowledge, sometimes it's an evolving thing, and sometimes it's hard to distinguish where the line draws between the old and the new, if there is anything like that. And then under the IP system, as we saw earlier, one of the key justifications is this incentive-based system for promoting innovation and creativity. And under the traditional knowledge system, many times the inventions or the innovation is driven largely largely on the basis of adaptation on realities in the society, on needs, and not so much by incentives. And so, there's that question. So where I once was out in an indigenous community in Canada, actually, and discussing the options of protecting traditional knowledge in that community. And when we got to a point of highlighting what the different forms were, and they had this traditional knowledge practice, and we talked about, okay, these are some of the options you could go through. And I remember clearly discussing or describing what the patent system would offer. And interestingly, when they heard about it, the big question was, after 20 years, then what happens? I said, well, then the knowledge falls into the public domain. So you are able to enjoy the commercialization of this knowledge for the period of 20 years. And then after that, society is able to benefit from that. And they were very clear that that is not a motivation for them at all. And for that reason, they didn't even want to go ahead with that, because they were more concerned about ensuring that the knowledge that exists today within their society is available in 7 generations, 4 generations down the line, and not so much just for them to be able to cash out on incentives for the 20-year period where many of them would be alive. And so indigenous communities, in many instances, as we find, have a completely different way of viewing the world. And that worldview, it sometimes plays out into how IP offers itself as a model of protection for indigenous knowledge. And then I would move on. Now, this is just talking about the value and significance of traditional knowledge. And so these are some examples of, that interaction between indigenous knowledge, indigenous communities. And so you see that the carpet, for instance, that's an indigenous pattern that was used by a hotel in Australia for the floors. And that really caused a lot of tension because the indigenous community felt that that was sacrilege. It was more or less, you shouldn't be walking on these patterns. They mean something. And so it was a bit of a challenge. Deep Forest is a CD that was released that hit, but was based on the beats and the traditional beats of an indigenous community that, again, raised a lot of questions around misappropriation. And then on the top left is the picture of the turmeric. Again, another instance of where this was patented, and eventually that was rescinded just because there was already a documentation record for that within in India. So I wanted to give a quick example, and I think many of you would have seen this in your reading, but this is an example of the San peoples and the hoodia plant. And the San peoples, as you see them there, they are spread across Botswana, Namibia, South Africa, and Angola, and they use the hoodia plant for centuries to keep themselves from being hungry and thirsty as they move across the Kalahari Desert. And so by chewing on that plant, they can go for days without eating or drinking water. Now, that plant was identified by the South African Council for Scientific and Industrial Research. And they took the plant to the lab to see what's making it happen like this. How can these guys be relying on this? And they're going for days without eating or drinking water. And they were able to isolate the P57 as a non-toxic appetite suppressant within the plant. And this was at the heart of major industry efforts to bring into the market a wide range of slimming products, which was valued in 2010 at over $3 billion in the US alone. Now, this was a very significant case because the San peoples were not consulted. They had no knowledge that this was going on. Even when the CSIR was able to obtain a patent and they were able to license it to other pharmaceutical companies to develop products based on that traditional knowledge, again, these guys were not involved. And so it led to conversations around benefit sharing and how to even structure that even after the fact. So it was a very interesting case that you might want to look into. And so that links me to the point I had made to you, Adetola, about and so I say just about another justification, another reason why a lot of talk about protecting traditional knowledge is really seen, and that's really efforts to protect it from biopiracy. And biopiracy is usually described as the unfair acquisition and or misuse of traditional knowledge, as well as genetic resources of indigenous peoples without the adequate compensation. In Morrison terms, we talk about not just compensation, but without their prior informed consent. And it's a major term that drives a number of initiatives around protecting traditional knowledge. Because of time, I won't go into some of these examples, but again, I'll be happy to make available the slides so that you can reflect on them. And so three main spots that have been difficult in the discussions on traditional knowledge on biopiracy is just that the contribution of indigenous communities to the broader global value chains are not always well recognized. Then we have the instances of the wrongful grant of IP rights over traditional knowledge and or genetic resources, again, playing into the questions around defensive and positive protection. And then we also have the non or inadequate compensation for external uses of traditional knowledge. And so that's where, even though there is acknowledgement, but there isn't proper compensation coming through. Okay, Juliana, thanks. I think I get the cue. I will I'll wrap up shortly. I can, okay, almost there. Now, so I just very quickly, I was just going to flag that some of the international, in terms of the international legal framework, some of the of the instruments that have played an important role and continue to play an important role in efforts to design protection frameworks for traditional knowledge include the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which kind of sets a baseline standard on how Indigenous peoples should be protected and the rights that they have. Even though it's a declaration, we've seen it increasingly playing out into all processes around Indigenous engagement, traditional knowledge, genetic resources, and the likes. And so it's a very important baseline. And Article 31 there talks about the right that Indigenous peoples have to maintain, control, protect, and develop their IP over their cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions. We also have, given the interrelationship between TK or traditional knowledge and genetic resources, we also have the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is driven to ensure the conservation of biodiversity, the sustainable use of its components, and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from its use. And so the Article 8J under the Convention on Biological Diversity does reference benefit sharing arising from the uses of traditional knowledge and genetic resources. And so again, it's a very important instrument, particularly because as I mentioned earlier, a number of communities refuse to draw that distinction between the traditional knowledge and the genetic resource. If we think back to the story or the example I gave about the Sand peoples, it's hard to say where the knowledge of the plant. And so if you say, for instance, we want to protect the traditional knowledge over the hoodia plant, but not protect the hoodia plant, the argument is always that, well, the traditional knowledge and the resource are completely intertwined. So the knowledge is linked to that resource. And so if you take away the resource, you take away that knowledge. And so that's why we have a category called traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources, which almost suggests that it's interwoven, right? And so when you're protecting one, you're protecting the other. And that's why genetic resources are regulated essentially by the Convention on Biological Diversity. And there has to be that reference under this instrument to also protect the associated traditional knowledge. Now, the CBD wasn't too effective. It was established in 93, entered into force, I beg your pardon, in 93. And so more recently, in 2010, there was a protocol that was developed on the platform of the CBD, which is known as the Nagoya Protocol. And this entered into force in 2014 and essentially tries to ensure that fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from use of GRs and traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources. And so it sets or establishes essentially an international regime which ensures cooperation across all countries that are party to the Nagoya Protocol and the CBD. Now, WIPO, as you mentioned, has also been involved in efforts to protect traditional knowledge. And we have what we call the Intergovernmental Committee on Intellectual Property and Genetic Resources, Traditional Knowledge and Folklore. Some argue that that's the longest title for a committee, but that committee has been looking since 2000 to establish or to develop a sui generis system that would ensure the effective protection of traditional knowledge, traditional cultural expressions, and genetic resources. And so there is currently there's currently work on at least 3 core areas on genetic resources, the texts being developed on genetic resources, on traditional knowledge, and also on traditional cultural expressions. Again, this is towards an international IP instrument or instruments that would ensure this effective protection. Now, we've touched already earlier on some of those things like definition of terms, and that's why I mentioned to you that there are instances where you see that traditional knowledge itself, just trying to define it, can take you an entire thesis, because some of the difficult issues are around definition of terms, identification of who the beneficiaries are. Some countries, for instance, insist that within their territories, there's no distinction between indigenous and non-indigenous peoples, that they are one homogeneous country. And so whenever you are protecting traditional knowledge, the beneficiary is the country and not an indigenous community within the country. Some other countries reject that view and say, no, you can't do that. It has to go to into the particular community from which that knowledge is sourced. But you see, where other countries say that goes against our constitution, all of us are one. We are one homogeneous people, homogeneous group, in which case, when we do that, we are dividing our country. And so we've had those kind of arguments. We also have instances where there are efforts to say, can an individual be a beneficiary of protection? Can a family be a beneficiary of protection? Does it have to be a community? And so within those communities, can you also have smaller groupings, like I mentioned, like individuals or even families? And a good example is where you think about traditional medicine. And I think one of the speakers earlier had referred to that. And you could have some communities where there's a particular family in the community that is known as the traditional healing or has the knowledge around traditional medicine. So if you're going to protect traditional knowledge in that context, is it the family or the entire community that still benefits, that is the beneficiary? Now, we're also dealing with issues of scope of protection, formalities. Does it need to be registered? Do you need to register traditional knowledge for it to be protected? And it's a wide gamut, but all of this is part of efforts to design what we call a sui generis system. That's a system that responds to the unique nature of traditional knowledge. It's not one that's based on just the other IP forms. And so we're not trying to amend a patent law or a trademark law, or a copyright law to protect traditional knowledge, but rather you're taking traditional knowledge and designing a system that responds to its unique character. And that's what essentially makes it a sui generis system. Now, again, like I mentioned, I'm going to send this to you, but some of the key questions that we've seen in the negotiations around the preventing of the grant of erroneous patents over GRs and associated to traditional knowledge, and also efforts to use the patent or IP system to ensure and track compliance with access and benefit sharing systems in national laws. I won't go into the disclosure requirement because of time, but again, if there are any questions on this, very happy to respond to that. And so with that, I come to the end of the presentation, and this class exercise will be there just to give you something to reflect on while you go back. But again, thank you so much and happy to take any questions. Juliana, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, sir. Wow, this is like so detailed, and like it exposes like the mind to like different aspects of traditional knowledge and cultural expression. Part of the issues that I think I heard about recently was the coming to America. I think they used some of the African prints and all that. Then I also heard, I think Germany or one of those countries sent back the African artifacts back to some African countries. Yes. So I think that it'd be good for there to be like a Swiss generis law for it and all that. Um, like you spoke about. Mr. Folarin is here, so I don't know if you'd like to just say something before the mentees ask their question. Mr. Folarin, would you like?
Hi.
Okay.
Okay. I'm
Welcome, sir.
sorry I joined a little late. I should apologize for that. I should come up, but I'm going to switch to my laptop. I'm using my mobile phone. Again, as always, well done, Juliana. Fantastic platform, fantastic conversation, and I should say, of course, our guest is our guy at the top, Mr. Toby Moody. You know, even though he has abandoned me, and I'm saying it for the whole world to hear, Toby has abandoned me. Let's just put that one there. You know, but fantastic presentation. Dr. Toby is an expert on TK, and he's someone that I think when he speaks, everybody should listen to. I think there's a huge conversation around TK in the world today, but you know, I think one of the big challenges that we have is when you're talking TK, you know, it's like people zone out. It seems to be the concept of traditional knowledge doesn't kind of, it sounds a little alien to many of us, you know, and for us, it's not traditional knowledge, it's the lives that we live, it's the customs that we have, it's our tradition, our history, you know, it's a part of us, of what we do. And I think there's a huge disconnect between marrying the concept of TK and the policies, protecting traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions with the realities of the people who actually live through these, or who use these customs on a daily basis. But I should say once again that Mr. Moody is doing a very fantastic job in driving this conversation and bringing it, to the fore. So well done, sir. I hope he's owing me one presentation, soft copies from one presentation. So I hope you would be kind enough to share this one. I see there's class exercise. He's a doctor, so he likes to give work. So Mr. Moody, please give us work. But fantastic presentation, world-class, top-notch. Thank you very much, sir.
Yes. Thank you very much, Mr. Folarin, for your contribution also. So Tola and Sewese, please, you can unmute yourself and ask your questions.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. This is Sewese. So thank you, Mr. Oluwatobi, for the insightful presentation and the detailed analysis on this subject. I find it really very interesting. So when I heard the topic at first, it looked like it was one of those boring areas, but after listening to your presentation, there's more lights that have been shared. So one area where I have a question would be with regards to equitable sharing of benefits. So I feel that that's a major challenge when it has to do with traditional knowledge and cultural expressions. So you might be able to register, you might be able to protect the rights and all of that, but when it comes to equitable sharing of benefits, I think that would be a major challenge. So are there any mechanisms that have been put in place, maybe by WIPO, with regards to that, something similar to like the Nagoya Protocol on equitable sharing of genetic resources? And then what approach can be used in resolving disputes arising from traditional knowledge and cultural expressions with regards to equitable benefits, sharing of benefits, sorry. So that was my question.
Okay, thank you, Sewese. What about you, Adetola? Do you have any question, or should Mr. Toby begin to answer?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I have a question. So my question is this: masquerades, music, art, and all of that, they are protected rights. Like I've come to know that they're actually protected. But in respect to geographical locations, say Ghana, the one I mentioned earlier, is there any form of protection? Because I read somewhere that there is a chocolate brand bearing Ghana. So is there any form of protection for such area? So that's basically my question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think I'll also ask a question. So for I think Beyonce's song and for Coming to America, they used like some African prints and all that. So for cultural expressions, for things that are in the art space that are linked to particular tribe and all that, when people use it, how how can the community benefit from it after it has been used already? Can they come together and write to them and all that to get something for what has been used? Thank you. Christina, do you have a question? Christina Longe, do you have a question? Okay, so if she doesn't have a question, Mr. Toby, you can go ahead to respond. Thank you.
All right. So thank you very much. I think these are all great questions, and for the ones I can't answer, I'll ask to go back and do some more reading and come back. But let me start with Suris's question. I think I'm glad you pointed out on the issue of equitable sharing of benefits, I agree with you completely that that's a key area, because in that phrase, or that is, there's the whole idea of equity. So we say equitable sharing. And so we've had instances, for instance, where a community or a like say like a company is able to say, we pay a local community, say $5,000 to develop something from their community, and the community is excited, they take it. And then the company is able to turn in profits of about $5 billion based on what they've been able to pay. Now, on the face of it, well, they've done what, and contractually they'll say, yes, we've done that. But then it comes into this question of equitable sharing of benefits, and how communities are able to negotiate effectively, these sharing of benefits. And it comes back to the Nagoya Protocol. And if you look in the Nagoya Protocol, there are a number of different ways of benefits and how benefits could be structured. And so there are short-term, there are milestones, there are royalties, there are development projects that could be considered. All of these are what I think are important in terms of creating awareness within communities towards how to design or to effectively negotiate equitable terms for the sharing of benefits. Now, remember that there are two main things that the Nagoya Protocol requires. So one is the prior informed consent of the community, and the other is the mutually agreed terms around a benefit sharing arrangement. Now, at the heart of this is a contractual thing. So you're still dealing with contracts. The most recently, within the Nagoya Protocols, let me just say within the CBD's recent major meeting that we had, the parties were looking towards, there's an Article 10 there, and there's what talks about a global multilateral benefit sharing mechanism. And what it does is, it's really coming from that point of the power relationships within individual contractual discussions around prior informed consent and mutually agreed terms is never balanced. And so when you have a corporation going into a community, it's usually almost like a Goliath negotiating with a David. It's almost like there's this major power imbalance. And so with the idea of a global multilateral benefit sharing mechanism, it's more like saying, if you use resources or you use traditional knowledge, then the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity could require or could design a mechanism where you basically pay in you pay in the agreed sums or whatever you're required to pay into a central place, and regularly these are distributed to the communities towards also advancing, and to the countries basically towards advancing conservation efforts. And so those are some of the ways that questions about equitable sharing of benefits are being addressed. Now, some countries, like an example is Mexico. Mexico has a lot of different communities that have similar traditional knowledge. And so what they tend to do is to say, look, we established a central negotiating, like a competent authority, which again, the protocol permits countries to do. And so they negotiate on behalf of the communities. And so when you're a corporation going in there, you deal with a central government agency or authority, you negotiate terms, and then based on that, they permit you to go into the communities. Now that's again another approach that helps to ensure that we get to that point of at least some form of equitable sharing of benefits. Otherwise, I think we're always going to run into that problem contractually. Now, you also touched on disputes. And I think you asked if there's anything WIPO is doing on that. And WIPO, I wouldn't say we're doing anything. What WIPO is, I think more what WIPO has been doing, and if we go on the WIPO website, you'll see that WIPO has a database of contractual terms for negotiating benefit sharing agreements. And so what WIPO has been able to do is to look into existing arrangements and how, I won't call them necessarily best practices, because it's not like we're endorsing one approach over the other, But it's just for communities that are involved in those kind of negotiations to be able to look and say, how have other communities approached this question? And be able to draw up some examples on terms that have recurred and to support, communities to be able to negotiate effectively when they have these kind of issues. And so those are some of the things that I would say that WIPO has been involved in. And of course, within the negotiations, the issue of benefit sharing, ensuring that it is implemented, has been something that a number of member states have made a major part of their negotiation. And by that, we mean that when you have a mechanism like benefit sharing, and just give an example, is if a company comes into a community in Nigeria and is able to bypass the benefit sharing obligations, but is also able to develop a product based on the knowledge and resources of that, and or resources of that community, but is still able to go to and is able to go back to the company comes from, I'll just give an example, say from Germany, but then it takes, and is able to go back to Germany and secure a patent in Germany without, complying with benefit sharing arrangements in Nigeria, then, there have been questions as to how can we allow that to happen? Does the patent system need to be able to say, no, if you're registering something that's based on traditional knowledge or genetic resources, you need to show us that you have complied with the benefit sharing arrangements that are in place in that country, no matter where you want to in the world. And that's the heart of the disclosure requirement that I skipped through earlier. And that's one of the ways that some member states have been trying to address this question of how do we ensure that benefit sharing happens so that people don't take from one country, run to secure rights in another country, and they're not checked. And so that's also what the Nagoya Protocol is trying to achieve. Now, disputes from benefit sharing, I honestly think that a lot of it is usually done because most of these kind of disputes are, in most instances, cross-border. They're usually across the international disputes. And so, again, I think a lot of it comes, we've seen in the past, a lot of it comes from, public opinion. You have a push many times to, a lot of communities have gone online to complain, and, you have, in the wind of public opinion, and then the companies come back and try and say, look, we're sorry, we didn't. So that's one, I'm not saying it's always the best. But then, of course, we have the arbitration mechanisms and the mediation mechanisms, which the protocol itself provides for. And so where there are disputes arising, I think it's Article 30, I don't recall off the top of my head, but they do provide for such kind of mechanisms that could address issues of benefit sharing. And of course, a lot of this also comes in because of the international dimensions. When there are major issues, you have international diplomacy also involved as part of benefit sharing, resolving such disputes. Now, Aditola, I'm not sure I got fully your question, because I wrote here, you referenced the idea that masquerades are protected, and then almost like a question about protecting Ghana. Now, are you talking about that in the context of trademarks? And I just wanted to understand what was being misappropriated. So maybe when I get through it, if you don't mind, I'll just come back so that I can really answer your question effectively. But I didn't fully understand that question. Now, Juliana's the question on communities getting back benefits from what has been used, I think similar to the response earlier to Suez's question, but I think there is a lot that goes back to the law. And unfortunately, in most instances, we find that where misappropriations happen, there isn't any established legal framework. And so, when there isn't a legal framework, it's a bit difficult to advance a right and to say, look, we want to fight for something. I think Folarin is here, so he's done something major recently on the Yoruba. So I think he might even be a better person to speak to that. But my understanding is that where there isn't a law, it's very difficult to advance or to secure such benefits back. But again, what we've seen is, given this international frameworks like the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, this emerging work at WIPO, it gives companies and communities the opportunity to push out and say, look, on moral grounds, this is completely wrong. You haven't given back to this community. You haven't acknowledged this community. And we demand to be compensated. We demand to be spoken with. And I think that's a pattern that I've seen several communities using to get back at least some benefits from, from such instances. In the case of the hoodia, for instance, that was already also gone already. And what had to happen was, again, with the public outrage, several of the companies began to pull out of the deal because they didn't want bad press, on their products and on their images. But also what we saw was that the government of South Africa then sat down with the San peoples and negotiated a deal based on the royalties that they were receiving from the assignments and the licenses that they have made on the P57. And so, of course, in the end, the San peoples benefited minimally, extremely minimally from the bigger picture, but at least it drove a conversation around benefit sharing and has been referenced even in future conversations around that till date. So I'm not sure if those answer the question. And Adetola, if she has a clarification, I'd be happy to take that.
Okay. My question is this simply. Is the name Ghana protected? Like in respect to the company using the name Ghana for its brand name, and then we know Ghana as a country, right? So is the name Ghana protected? That's basically
So the name.
Yes.
Okay. So similar to saying, is the name Nigeria protected, or is the name United Kingdom protected? Is it almost like just talking about the protection of country names?
Yes, yes.
Yes. So again, that's it. That's another aspect of protection that, of course, does exist. Particularly because when we deal with at that level, I'd say it's a specialized area, but there is definitely protection for country names, right? And it's part of I'd say it's part of more under, we see that discussion more under trademark law, but there is definitely protection for country names. Unfortunately, I don't have all the references to be able to address that effectively now. And that's one of the examples I think I can come back to you on fully, but definitely there is protection for country names.
Thank you. Thank you. So do we have any more questions from anyone that's joining us? Say, do you have any more question? Adetola, do you have any more question? Or are we done? Do we understand the topic?
Yes, ma, we do. No more questions.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir, for your time. Thank you for sharing with us. Some of our mentees are writing exam, so that's the reason why they're not here. But the the recording was streamed online, and it was also recorded. Sorry, the program was recorded and it was also streamed online. So hopefully they would go back and watch it because they'll have to write a report on that. Thank you for the time. So I would like to acknowledge Mr. Folarin for coming. Thank you, Mr. Rama, for also joining us. Mr. Rama is the former director of WIPO of New York. So thank you for also joining us. Thank you, sir. You have always been there for us. You have always shared your knowledge with people whenever they are willing to learn. And so we're excited about this. And definitely, personally, I'll have to go and listen to it again because there were some things that I heard that I've not heard before. And as I explained to you that time, before I was just studying like a particular part of IP. So this is like a totally new area. And I'm happy that I'm also learning about it. Mr. Folari is already swimming in the waters already because he's he's already doing something on the folk law dance and all that he has taken to court. So he's my senior brother. Then so thank you so much, sir. I appreciate it. Thank you for the time. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure. And I will send in a written response to Adetola's question as well, just so that, she has that. Yeah.
Okay, sir. Thank you. And we'll also be expecting the slides so that
Yes,
you can share it with those that did not attend. All
we'll do
right.
that. And Mr.
Thank
Folari, I'll touch base with you so I can get those slides across to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you.
Thank
So,
you very much, sir. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Juliana, for mediating between my Oga and myself.
thank you. Thank you, sir. So, I wish everyone an amazing weekend and a very peaceful rest and all that. Take care of yourselves. Bye. See you
Thank you.
next week.
Okay. Well, thank you, ma'am. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.